All right, today, number 2 on our list of all the men and women of the Bible. A man by the name of Abednego, or, as we usually call him, Abednego, or sometimes Abednego. How it's usually, maybe that's just the fast way of saying it, or maybe people just can't read, but that's usually what it sounds like when it comes out anyway. Just like Nebuchadnezzar. But anyway, Abednego was the name of one of the young elite or high-class princes of Judah, for lack of a better word, who were carried away into Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. And we talked about last week, we mentioned how we're going to include his friends with him in this, because it would be silly not to. We're not going to include one of his other friends, Daniel, but we know them by their given names, the names that were assigned to them after the Babylonian captivity. The ironic thing, difference between him and them and Daniel is most of us know these guys strictly by their Babylonian names, and nobody really remembers their Hebrew names. Whereas Daniel, for whatever reason in the Scriptures, is called by his Hebrew name for most of the time. But his Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. I think I mentioned last week a good trivia question would be, who told Pharaoh, "Let my people go"? And most people would say Moses. Well, this is another good trivia question. Who's Belteshazzar? And a lot of people won't have any idea who that is. Partly because we don't call him that. Partly because there's another name that's very similar to that in the Old Testament, Belshazzar. Almost the exact same name, just a couple letters different. But Abednego was also known as Azariah. And his two friends, with the similar sounding names, at least the last part, Shadrach and Meshach, were also called Hananiah and Mishael. But there's something important about these guys when we look at their Hebrew names as opposed to their Babylonian names. The name Hananiah means "to whom Jehovah is gracious." Remember the key word, the key sound in an Old Testament name that lets you know that the name of God is in that name? Yah or Ayah, like Isaiah and Jeremiah and all these Yah names, means that Jehovah, Yahweh's name, is in that name. So Hananiah and Azariah, for that matter, both have the name of Jehovah. Mishael doesn't have Yahweh, but it has El, which is God, just the word God. So Mishael means "who is what God is." So Hananiah means "to whom Jehovah is gracious." Mishael means "who is what God is." And whenever that's a Hebrew person, obviously God is Jehovah. And then Azariah means "whom Jehovah helps." But their Chaldean names, a little bit different. Shadrach, Hananiah's name was changed to Shadrach. Shadrach either means inspiration of the sun, who was a god, or the decree of the moon god. So keep that in your mind. Meshach means belongs to Sheshach, which is Venus, another god or goddess. And then Abednego means servant of Nego, or servant of the shining fire, also a reference to a god. With that in mind, why do you think they gave them new names? What happened in the name change? Yeah, Jehovah was removed from their names, and these other gods were inserted into their names. And that was a significant thing for them. We don't put as much stock in our names, but they would have. Yep. You mean why their names, why Daniel keeps being called Daniel? Could be. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that had something to do with it. Yeah. You mean why they changed their names or why they are referred to their names? Daniel kept being called Daniel. Maybe also it had something to do with Daniel. If Daniel wrote the book of Daniel, maybe that had something to do with it too. Why he kept calling himself that, but he came to know these guys more as those names. It's hard to say. One thing seems pretty clear though. The reason their names were changed was to get rid of their God. And again, we have to understand the significance of the meanings of names to them, because to us it's like, well, change my name, that's not going to get rid of God in my life. But it meant something. It actually could have had an effect. So erasing their past life, their former religious background would be the reason for that name change. But what we can learn about these four, and we're not including Daniel in this because Daniel deserves he ought to be considered on his own, because while their histories do overlap and they were a group of friends, Daniel's place in Scripture went way beyond this. There's really two chapters that we consider when we talk about these three Hebrew young men, and we learn about them in both of these chapters, especially about their character in chapter 3. But it's Daniel chapter 1, and then they sort of fade out, and then they come back up in chapter 3, and then they fade out again. But there are some things that we learn about these three. And Abednego, or Azariah, they made good life choices, is what we learned from chapter 1. Daniel 1, these guys made good life choices. We learned about them here a little bit. They were youths without blemish. They were in this group, so anything that this group is described as applies to them. Youths without blemish, well-favored, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and such as had ability to stand in the king's palace. That's the kind of men they were, young men. They were probably quite young. We don't know how old they were. We don't know how old Daniel was, for that matter. But based on how long Daniel's ministry lasted, he was either extremely young at this time or extremely old by the time he was thrown in the lion's den, because a lot of years that covered. He had possibly, with the exception of Jeremiah, possibly the longest ministry of all the prophets. So either he was excessively young and by this time when the captivity occurred, or extremely old by the time his ministry ended, and by chapter 6 for that matter. So these were very young, but they had a good reputation, but they had good friends. Not good friends like close friends. They had friends that were good people. And that was going to make a huge difference in their lives. What they were coming there to do was being trained. They were taken there by their enemy captors. But the best of them who satisfied these conditions were going to be taken here to basically be enrolled into a school where they would be trained to serve the king. And what the king wanted was youth without blemish, good appearance, skillful in wisdom, competent to stand in the king's palace. And then they were going to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans and be educated for 3 years. This is a 3-year program. And at the end of that time, they were going to stand before the king of Babylonia. So they had a good reputation. Proverbs 22:1 says, a good reputation and respect are worth much more than silver and gold. First Timothy 4:12. Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech and manner of life, in love, and faith, and purity. Abednego and his 2 friends and Daniel in there seemed to do that. They knew that was true. They knew the wisdom in that. They also understood that it was not wise to be unequally yoked with unbelievers, and that bad company corrupts good morals. I don't think there's any way to take it any other way than if these men had not had this close, godly friendship with each other, then their good morals would have been corrupted. And when we get to chapter 3, we'll see just how important their friendship with these others was. Made a huge difference. We can only assume, naturally, it made a huge difference. They had each other. Mm-hmm. I guess they probably did. He probably got wherever he could find them. He wanted the best of wherever he could find them. So I don't know. We don't know. That's another thing. We don't know how many Hebrew young men were taken into this program. All of them were taken, but we don't know how many were taken into this program. But the ones that shine out are these 4: Daniel and Azariah and Hananiah and Mishael. And probably because wherever Nebuchadnezzar was going along and conquering, he was going to try to find the best possible people that he could find. Otherwise, you're right, it would have made a lot more sense to get Babylonian young men. They would have at least had a chance of being more loyal to the king. But the best wherever they could get them, I guess the more he had, the better he looked. Look at all these fine young men I've got right at my disposal in my service. But, yep, great question. So now he's conquered yet another nation, and he's getting another stock of fresh servants who will be taking part in this brainwashing camp, probably. It's probably the kind of thing it was. But how will they hold up? All we know is among this group were these four Hebrew young men. But what we learned ended up happening here, part of this program was that they were going to be allowed to eat from the king's storehouses, the king's own table. They were given that privilege, eating the king's food. And while the rest of chapter 1 sort of singles out Daniel, we understand that the other 3 were involved. And they're actually brought up in verse 11. But Daniel must have been the leader, the one who was, sort of took the initiative in this resolve not to eat of the king's food. Yeah. Taken from their parents, which, by the way, being so young and being this strong, who are we to blame for this? Blame in a good way. Their parents obviously would have had a lot, everything to do with the kind of young men they turned out to be. So we read in verse 8, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs, and it all worked out. So Daniel said, I'm not even going to, and the other 3, I don't want to risk defiling myself. Surely the king would have all kinds of different foods, but he viewed that as being a defilement. So even the risk of it, let us just eat vegetables and leave the rest alone. Yes?
You know, like you were talking about last week, peer pressure. I mean, these people stayed together because they identified with each other as followers of children of Israel. And it's the same thing with the church. If you surround yourself with people of like faith, you're going to be strengthened to do what's right. So peer pressure can be either negative or positive.
Yeah, it works both ways. And that's why it's so important. It is kind of the same thing, but it's a little different. You know, encouragement to do the right thing is maybe a kind of peer pressure, but it's different at the same time, probably because the motive is different, and it's out of concern and care and love rather than, hey, do what we're doing. But yeah, imagine if they hadn't had that, because there were a lot more Jewish young men involved in this program. But these four are the four who, the only four that we seem to get the impression had this resolve. Mainly thanks to Daniel. Daniel was the one that took the forefront. He said, I'm not going to do this, and the other three joined in with that. The chief of the eunuchs was a little bit wary about it, so he devised a little test. Daniel said, okay, just let us do a little test, and you let us try this, and you can see if you can tell. He was worried that it would be noticeable, and that he was worried about himself getting in trouble. And it worked out. God gave favor. He let them test for 10 days. Notice it says Daniel said, test your servants, and let us be given vegetables, and let our appearance, see, it wasn't just Daniel. There were others, and it seems that those others were at least Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if not others, but especially those other three. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them, so Daniel was not alone. And it worked out. So another good decision. Lest they even accidentally violate God's law, they were going to take every precaution not to do that, and God providentially saw to it that it was never found out. There was no offense given. There was no questions raised. It all perfect. Everybody wins. And verse 17 again says, as for these four youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature. They rose above everybody else. They excelled. Maybe not rose at this point, but they excelled so that by the end of that 3 years, it says, verse 19, among all of them, none was found like Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. Pretty high praise. They flourished and stood before the king. Now, that sets up the next thing we learn, and lesson we learn from them. They said no to the king of the world. They made good life choices. And this is something that you might say is exactly the opposite of that. This is not a good life choice. This is a good death choice. But because of their strong resolve, because of their faith, here's what ended up happening. Remember, they're standing before the king. They were put in some sort of political position, of some kind, government position. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar came up with the idea to make an image of gold that was 90 feet tall. That's pretty big. 9 basketball goals stacked on top of each other. That's how tall it was. Very, very large. He set it up, and he gathered all these people around, all of these government officials. a lot of which we don't even know exactly what they were, satraps and prefects and governors and counselors and treasurers and justices, magistrates, all the officials of the provinces to the dedication. And they were told, as most of us know, the story goes, that whenever you hear the sound of the music, fall down and worship this golden image. Now, it doesn't explicitly say, but it seems to me to be pretty understood this image was of him. It doesn't say it was of him, it just said he made it. He set it up. But I think it's pretty clear it was him. It was an image of him. But whatever it was an image. It was not Jehovah, and even if it had been Jehovah, Jehovah wouldn't have wanted any part of it. He commanded them to bow down in worship of this image whenever they get the signal. Now, at this point, it sounds like a one-time deal, but we get the impression later on this was not a one-time deal. This was the dedication, but there was some system set in place where they were to do this regularly at some intervals. Otherwise, the story makes no sense because it would have just been one time, but the people, when they told on them, said they don't do this. They don't bow down to the image, rather than saying they didn't bow down to the image whenever they were supposed to. Well, we read that all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image at the cue. All, that is, but 3 of them. We don't know where Daniel was at this time, what he was doing. We know where he was, roughly speaking. We don't know why he's not included in this. What we do know is that his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, did not bow down. Kind of reminds us of Mordecai, doesn't it? With Haman. He was the only one that did not bow down to Haman. Every time Haman's special little royal feet walked by, or rode by maybe, and he got his little feelings hurt. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down to this image. And what we read is, oh, by the way, I missed this part. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. You know the word that stands out to me, and that's why I read it that way? Immediately. That's a big old word for that kind of thing. If punishment happened immediately, there'll be a lot less crime. Immediately, you will be taken and immediately thrown into this furnace. Just like that. No trial. No, sitting around in a jail cell for months and years until maybe they get around to it and probably won't. You will immediately be thrown into a fiery furnace. Well, verse 8 then says, therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. Now, what motive could these Chaldeans possibly have for accusing the Jews? By the way, it doesn't say they falsely accused the Jews. It was malicious, but what they said was true, wasn't it? More or less. Why would they want to do that? Well, I would go back to chapter 1, the end of chapter 1. Okay, they're not Chaldeans. What else? They worshipped a different god. What else? Yeah, they were better than everybody else. Well, that's pretty standard, isn't it? Nobody likes the best when you're not the best. Well, maybe not nobody, but most people. If you're better than them, they want to tear you down, bring you down. Well, that's what's happening here. The Chaldeans, of course, they're not going to like the Jews, not just because they're Jews, because they're better than them. And they've succeeded more than them. So they accused the Jews and told the king, yada, 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 you made this decree. But Shadrach, there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see, he called out just those three, which would seem to suggest however many other Jews were appointed, what'd they do? Apparently bowed down. Otherwise, I don't know why they just singled them out, unless it was they were seriously that upset about them being better than them. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They don't serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. And here they remind us of Mordecai. Here he reminds us of Haman. He was furious. Yep.
Couldn't this also be what Debbie was talking about? There were citizens in their country who felt they deserved it more than these foreigners.
I'm sure they felt that way.
And
You would
so,
think. Yeah.
these are foreigners. Why did you bring them in?
Yeah, that had to have had something to do with it. And that's probably why, there are certain Jews that do this, and then they named them. But the fact that they were Chaldeans and they maliciously accused the Jews, it just so happened, though, that the thing that they were accusing them of specifically was true. It wasn't a lie. But they did word it in a way to induce the king's anger. They don't pay attention to you. Again, which strictly speaking was true, because what they're talking about is they didn't do what you said to do. They don't do what you say to do. They don't serve your gods, and they don't worship the golden image you've set up. Well, he was in a furious rage. And he commanded that he summoned them before him. Now this is the part where we should give credit where credit's due, okay? Nebuchadnezzar may not be worthy of much credit at all, but at least we'll give him this much, this tiny little bit. He asked them directly and gave them another chance, or at least wanted to confirm. He said, "Is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the golden image I set up? Is that true?" So let's give him that much credit. May not get any other credit, but at least he did that. And he said, "I'll give you another chance. Forget what happened before. Don't care if you did or you didn't. I'm going to give you another chance to do exactly what he told everybody to do. Same instructions. And if you don't, you will immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." And here's a part. Any credit we might give him just vanishes here. "And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Yeah, my big, strong, kingly hands. These are the hands of a God themselves, he probably thought. Yeah. Well, they're going to tell him which God. And this is where we are infinitely impressed with these three young men who are, 3 years older than they were before, but they're still probably fairly young. Maybe what? Depends. I mean, the Hebrew word translated youths is so elastic and flexible. I mean, it could range from 30 years or so, but they were probably teenagers, 20s at the most, I would say, at this point. So here's their response. It's just mind-blowing. Remember, this is Nebuchadnezzar, the king that God described as the one who just comes through, kills everybody, conquers whatever he wants, whatever he lays his eyes on, he wants it, he takes it, he kills everybody however he wants. Ruthless. The same king who gouged out the king of Judah's eyes, but not until after he made him watch his sons get murdered. So the last thing that he saw probably was the gruesome murder of his sons, and then his eyes are gouged out. He did that. Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego answered, "O Nebuchadnezzar, We have no need to answer you in this matter. This is one of those times where I wish I could just see his face. I want to see his face. When he heard that already, it probably looked like a cartoon. Smoke coming out of his ears, and he's sitting there. What? Yeah. Look at the challenge. Who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, that is, if you will throw us into the fiery furnace, like you said, if that thing is going to happen, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. There's the answer to his challenge. Who's the God? Our God. But if not, it just gets better and better. But if not, be it known to you, O king, we're still not going to do it. Well, if he wasn't filled with rage before, he is now. Look, talking about wishing we could see his face, here's the closest we get. The expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Doesn't give us exactly what it looked like, but it didn't look like what it looked like before. He probably viewed them favorably before. Not anymore. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than usual. I don't think that's meant literally. We talk about how numbers are symbolic. 7 times probably just means hot as they could possibly physically make it. I don't think they had a measuring device. They could get exactly 7 times hotter. But you make that thing as hot as you can possibly make it. And then they bound them up in their cloaks and tunics and hats and every garment they could get on them so they could burn quicker, catch quicker. Or maybe that would make it even more painful. But it was so hot, in fact, that the men who escorted them died. But just think about knowing who Nebuchadnezzar is. And they say, number one, our God is able to deliver us. He may not be willing, but He's able. But we think He will. We believe He is willing. But even if He's not willing, doesn't change a thing. That is a powerful lesson for people today. How many times have you heard the charge against God? And atheists do this sometimes. They think it's a logical trap. The God of the Bible is either not all-powerful or He's not all-loving. He can't be both, because if He was both, look around and tell me why these things happen. Why do kids die? Why do little kids get cancer? Why does anybody get cancer? Why do people have car wrecks? Why does this stuff happen? If God was all-loving and all-powerful, or all good and all-powerful, those things wouldn't happen. So they think they've won, and that's a trap, and argument over. What they don't take into consideration is, many things, that they don't understand how God works. Number two, they don't respect God the way these three.
This all thing was happening to these three young men, not because of God, but because of the evil Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, God didn't have anything to do with this. As far as the bad, this wasn't God's idea. But they're saying, we know that our God is able to deliver us. But we're not going to be mad at Him if He doesn't. That's His decision, in other words. We know He can do it, but if He wants to do it, is up to Him. And we're telling you right now that even if He called down and said, not going to do it, we're still not going to bow down. If God shouted down and answered and said, by the way, guys, I'm not going to deliver you from that furnace, they're saying, we still will jump in. Yeah. Yeah, remember this morning Mordecai said, hey, if you don't go to the king, you're going to die. If you go to the king, you might die. If you don't go to the king, you will die. So they knew if they get thrown in that furnace, they're going to stand before God. Wouldn't it be better to stand before God and say, God, I didn't bow down. than to, say, well, I didn't want to bow down, but we gave up. We gave in. And then say, God, why didn't you do something? Maybe. Why didn't you help? Or one day, when they did die, to stand before God and say, remember that time? But no, they were willing to be thrown into that furnace, whether God was going to save them or not. That was irrelevant, because that's God. God is God, and they're not. It's again one of those Romans 9:20 things. God's will is up to God. But we ought to share the faith and courage of these three. Even if God doesn't save me from this, or this, spare me, I'm still going to bow down to Him and Him alone. So, lessons. Some things we can take from this. Even God's dearest servants must sometimes pass through heavy trials. Yep.
Also, though, they had a clear conscience in that all the training they went through, they had done everything in their power to be pleasing to God, and so being in that situation, versus we a lot of times get ourselves in situations because we are making
Yeah.
decisions. You know what I mean?
They've taken every precaution to not displease God. Just like Paul said, we make it our aim in everything to be well-pleasing to God. Paul was cut from the same cloth as these three, literally and spiritually. Even God's dearest servants must pass through heavy trials. It was sort of mentioned in passing Wednesday night about, the prosperity preaching and all this about, if you will do this or do this and give this much or become a Christian, your suffering will be over, your trials will be over, you'll prosper, you'll flourish. That's not true. How many people do we have to read about in the Bible to learn that that's not true? Even Jesus. And not just because, but He's the Son of God and He came here to do. No, if that's true, then why would that happen to even Jesus? Or Peter, or Paul, or any of the other apostles, or any other man or woman of God before Christ? It's just not true. Even God's dearest servants must pass through heavy trials sometimes, but God will. He may not deliver them from ever suffering those things, but He will see them through those things. Ultimately, we're on this imperfect earth, the product of our own creation. God created the universe, but we created the mess. So as long as we're here, it is inevitable. Just like Jesus said, occasions of temptation to stumble will come. Well, a lot of other things will come too, like suffering, trials, tribulations, not just temptations, but other types of human suffering. Even God's servants. Notice, He did not keep these four from suffering. Daniel may not have been thrown into the furnace, but he was thrown into the lion's den later. And by the way, just so we get the end of the story, they were thrown in there, didn't burn, didn't get hurt, and there was a fourth one in there that Nebuchadnezzar said, he looks like a son of the gods. And his tune was changed a little bit, for a little while anyway. But my favorite thing is that it said they didn't even smell like smoke or like fire. Which the smell of fire is smoke. It's like, good grief. There's all kind of miracles going on here. That may be the most impressive one. You sit by a campfire for 3 minutes and you'll smell like smoke for a week. They didn't even smell like smoke. And all those clothes they bundled on them didn't burn either. So, even God's dearest servants must sometimes pass through heavy trials. Number 2, God's able to deliver when help seems farthest away. Just like they said, God's able. Even if He doesn't, He's still able. And if He doesn't, we're okay with that. He's God, not us. Yep. Yeah, when you see 3, even just 3, the 3 guys you threw in there, standing there, hanging out, in the middle of a fire, that'll change your mind. Yeah. They couldn't even throw them in there. Which, by the way, so almost seems to suggest that these three jumped in themselves, because the men who were taking them to get thrown in died. So I guess they just, here we go, And they knew God would deliver them somehow. And He did. Yeah, they didn't care. And they said they didn't care. We would rather jump in that furnace than bow down to your God. That is, words can't even express how impressive that is. God's furnace purifies but never destroys His faithful. And number 4, God's children must never be ashamed to Him. I thought in one of the Bible dictionaries is a good quote, said, "A tyrant may change the name, but not the nature of one true to God." So, just like these guys, Daniel included, they may have taken Jehovah out of their names. And by the way, Daniel also has El, God, in it. Daniel. I don't know if I put it in there, the meaning of his name, but we'll see him eventually. He may have taken Jehovah out of their names, but he didn't take Jehovah out of their hearts. And therefore, there was nothing that could have happened to them that would have changed that. So, how do we match up to that? Maybe not too good, but that doesn't have to be that way. We can change that. We are very blessed. We don't have anybody threatening to throw us in a fiery furnace if we don't bow down to a golden image, but we might run into lesser versions of this daily. It all comes down to, are we going to have the same resolve they had?